How could a shockwave all the way in the Middle East put pressure on Beijing's strategy of the century? Why would China be among the first economies to absorb a deep structural hit if Iran's political situation unraveled? These are not hypothetical questions. They are already being asked in boardrooms, energy desks, and foreign ministries around the world. Let's start with a number that reframes the entire conversation. On March 2nd, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz went unusually quiet. On a normal day, roughly 79 supertankers passed through that narrow passage. That morning, the number dropped to 7. Around 150 vessels dropped anchor and waited. Within days, the biggest maritime insurance firms began suspending war risk coverage for the Gulf. Freight rates on the Shanghai to Jebel Ali corridor doubled almost overnight, and chartering a supertanker on the Middle East to China route was running above $424,000 per day. Now here is the part that most coverage gets wrong. The popular assumption is that the United States would be the most exposed party in a Hormuz disruption. The data tells a different story. According to the United States Energy Information Administration, the country imported roughly 500,000 barrels of crude oil per day through that choke point in 2023, amounting to around 2% of total liquid fuel consumption. Losing 2% creates short-term price discomfort. It does not create a structural crisis. The economies that carry the real exposure are in Asia. Up to 83% of the oil that moves through the Strait of Hormuz flows toward Asian markets. China, India, Japan, and South Korea alone account for roughly 69% of that flow. If the strait was seriously disrupted, the United States would experience a spike at the pump. Asia, and China in particular, would absorb a blow that cuts into the operating capacity of the entire industrial base. To understand why that matters so much for China specifically, you have to understand what Beijing has been building for over a decade under the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative is frequently described in the press as an infrastructure program, but that framing undersells what it actually is. It is closer to an operating system for economic connectivity, layering together infrastructure, trade agreements, investment flows, and political relationships across dozens of countries. One of its 6 core corridors is formally designated as the China, Central Asia, and West Asia Economic Corridor. The Western expansion was not an afterthought, and it was embedded in the original design. According to figures Beijing released in 2025, trade between China and Belt and Road partner countries grew from $2.7 trillion in 2021 to $3.1 trillion in 2024. That volume now represents over 50% of China's total foreign trade. Capital flows between China and this group crossed $240 billion between 2021 and the first half of 2025. Within that framework, Iran occupies a position that is difficult to replicate. Geographically, Iran sits at the intersection of 3 distinct strategic spaces. Its northern border touches Central Asia and the Caspian corridor, and its southern coast opens directly onto the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Its western flank connects to Turkey, the Caucasus region, and through those links to Europe. Very few countries offer that combination simultaneously. Beijing recognized this early. In 2016, President Xi Jinping publicly announced a commitment to comprehensive cooperation with Iran under the Belt and Road framework. In 2021, Foreign Minister Wang Yi traveled to Tehran, and both sides announced a 25-year comprehensive cooperation agreement. On the energy side, analysis from the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University found that China imported roughly half of its crude oil from the Middle East region in 2025. Our satellite tracking indicated that China was importing approximately 1.38 million barrels per day from Iran itself, accounting for around 12% of total imports. When you add up the volumes tied directly or indirectly to Hormuz, somewhere between 45 and 50% of the oil-keeping Chinese industry operational passes through that single narrow waterway. China does have short-term buffers. As of early 2026, Beijing held approximately 1.39 billion barrels of strategic petroleum reserves, enough to cover roughly 120 days of net imports. These are meaningful cushions. They are not substitutes for a stable, long-term supply relationship. The connectivity question raises a parallel issue. And China and its partners have been actively building overland infrastructure through Iran for years. The planned integration of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor with the Tehran to Islamabad Railway Corridor represents a $6.8 billion project, with China funding up to 90% of the costs. The goal is a land and sea bridge reaching from China's western provinces through Pakistan, into Iran, across to Turkey, and down to the Mediterranean. If the political environment in Iran deteriorates to the point where contractors cannot operate and logistics providers withdraw, the physical infrastructure remains, but the strategic corridor effectively stops functioning. Some analysts point to the Trans-Caspian Middle Corridor as a potential alternative, running from China through Central Asia across the Caspian Sea, chugged through Azerbaijan and Georgia into Turkey. The World Bank has modeled scenarios where this corridor could triple freight throughput by 2030. In 2024, actual throughput was around 4.5 million tons, up 62% year over year. The growth rate is real. The absolute capacity remains far below what would be needed to compensate for the loss of the Iran corridor. More importantly, the Middle Corridor does not provide a port on the Persian Gulf, and it does not give Beijing the same political foothold in Gulf diplomacy. The broader Belt and Road Initiative would not collapse if Iran's situation deteriorated sharply. A collapse in Tehran would not bring down the entire framework. What it would do is remove the western axis of the strategy, the part that extends China's reach into the Gulf, and positions Beijing as a mediator in Middle Eastern disputes, and secures a diversified energy supply chain independent of choke points that others control. That particular piece of the architecture has no ready substitute, and it has been the focus of roughly a decade of sustained diplomatic and economic investment. The question worth watching is not whether China would survive such a scenario. With its reserve buffers and existing relationships elsewhere, it would adapt. The question is what it would cost in terms of strategic position, energy security margin, and the timeline of the westward expansion that has been central to Beijing's long-term planning. What we are watching unfold across the Middle East is not simply a regional conflict, it is a stress test for the assumptions that have guided global infrastructure investment, on energy pricing, and supply chain geography for the better part of a decade. The Belt and Road Initiative was built on the premise that overland and maritime corridors through partner countries could give China a durable alternative to dependence on any single route. Iran was one of the foundational nodes in that architecture. What happens to the broader framework when a foundational node comes under pressure is a question with no clean historical precedent, and the answer will unfold gradually through logistics data, freight rates, and capital allocation decisions made quietly in offices far from any front line. If this kind of analysis helps you see the mechanics behind the headlines, consider subscribing to the Capital Anatomy channel, or we break down the economic and geopolitical forces shaping the world in terms of how they actually work, not just what they look like from the surface. Hit the like button if this gave you a clearer picture of how China's strategic exposure connects to events in the Gulf, and share it with anyone who thinks seriously about global economics and power. The next deep dive is already in the works.